to the to what poverty brings to our door, right? We're kind of nibbling at the edges of inequity and poverty. And what I want us to do as a rule in the City of Tucson Housing Community Development Department is take a look at the root causes of poverty, at the root causes of homelessness, and attack those. Without doing that, we will continue managing homelessness and poverty in our community and never really get to undo and to empower and to end homelessness. So it's a big task ahead, but I know that we can do it. We have a lot of talent. We have a lot of knowledge in the community, and I'm really happy that we're starting this conversation and that we're allowing and providing a space for the community to come together and think outside the box, even though we find ourselves in boxes right now. Think outside of the box in doing things differently so that we can tackle these big issues that face us, specifically and especially marginalized communities and communities of color, and not just in Tucson and Arizona, but in our country. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I appreciate your thoughts and your comments. And yeah, you're welcome to hang out with us for a while. I know you have a busy day. But
I will.
great.
I'll join you for a bit just to listen to some of these wonderful experts and friends of mine that I love hearing. So I'll stick around and then jump off when I need to.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a great conversation.
Okay. So we'll do some introductions. I'm going to ask the panelists just to introduce themselves. So I'll just kind of call you off by name. So we'll start with our Ward 1 Council member, Lane Santa Cruz.
Hi, buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join y'all in this conversation. I understand this is a part 2 to a dialogue y'all started earlier. I'm Lane Santa Cruz, the Ward 1 Council member that represents the west side, a little bit of downtown, and the southwest side of the city. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for being here today. Appreciate it. Debbie Chess.
I'm Debbie Chess. I'm the Executive Director of the Dunbar Pavilion, located actually in Ward 1, 325 West 2nd Street. We are the segregated school, the first and only segregated school in Tucson, closed now as a segregated school and emerging as an African-American Center for Art and Culture.
Great, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Claudia Powell.
Hi, my name is Claudia Powell, and I am the Associate Director and a Research Professor at University of Arizona Southwest Institute for Research on Women, otherwise known as ISIROW. And my work centers around health disparities and specifically in homelessness. And I've worked in the field of research on youth homelessness, LGBTQ specifically, for the past 15 years.
Okay, thank you. And Jay Young.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here. My name is Jay Young, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Fair Housing Council. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of housing segregation in Tucson and how that legacy is still very much with us today. So again, thank you for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And then Tom Litwicki, and Tom's going to introduce yourself, and then also Tom's going to give us just a brief description of OPCS, who we are as an organization, and what Housing First is.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to the panelists and for everyone listening in. Thank you, Mayor. OPCS is a nonprofit, and we've been around since 1996, and we are dedicated to reducing homelessness in Tucson. Specifically, we have an emphasis to end chronic homelessness in Tucson and Pima County. Every year we communicate and work with about 1,200 households. And on average now, our last year, we had 800 folks move into permanent housing. We have about 10 bridge sites in which about 150 people, individuals and households live. These are temporary sites where people can get off the streets or get out of institutions while we help them get housing. And then we're thrilled to say that we have a couple hundred households that we're working in a hotel under the city's CARES funding. And so far, about 130 households from there have moved into permanent housing. And then we have scattered site housing, which is people with a lease. It's kind of the golden ticket that we want people to get to where they have a lease and they're living independently in the community where they want to live and how they want to live and with whom they want to live. So the Housing First strategy, as the mayor had mentioned earlier, is really about moving from managing homelessness, which is kind of our traditional systems, to actually solving homelessness. Traditional systems of homeless services, shelters, things like that, have an assumption that individuals have some sort of a character defect that has led to their homelessness. And so the emphasis is on getting people to first engage in a lot of services, fix whatever's wrong with themselves, and then they can have the opportunity to get housing. Housing First turns that on its head and says that individuals first need a safe place to live, someplace with a bed, a bathroom, and a kitchen where they can lock the door and sleep at night and be safe. And that is something that everyone deserves, and that as a community is what we should be doing. And then basically what you find is that people start to get better and people start to work on all the other problems they have. But the housing has to come first, not the services. So housing isn't something you earn. Housing is something that you deserve as a human being who resides in our community. The model assumes that people are capable and deserving of housing, and so that's it. It's an evidence-based model, and so it's been demonstrated as being most successful from the models we know today when you look at the scientific literature of actually reducing homelessness. So from this is why OPCS has hosted the Housing First Forum, and this year, instead of in person, in a Zoom format, which has a lot of great benefits. We've been able to have numerous community discussions and have it available and accessible to more people. So we're thrilled for the opportunity to do that and thrilled to have such a knowledgeable and compassionate panel today to talk about our topic of equity. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I realized I didn't introduce myself. So I'm Michael Becker. I'm the board chair of OPCS. I'm an architect and a principal with Swain Associates, local architecture firm, and I will be moderating the panel today. So thanks again for everybody for coming. So the way we're going to structure this, we're going to, three of the panelists will be doing a brief presentation, just sort of in their area of expertise, and then we'll move into sort of an open discussion about about the subject today. Really what we're looking at is, inequity in housing and homeless services and how that sort of trickles through the community and what we can do as an organization and as individuals to really start to turn that around. So we'll start off with Jay. He has a brief presentation on the history, I think, of housing discrimination.
Thank you, Michael. Let me share my screen and see if I can get my slides going here. All right, can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right, so again, thank you everyone for allowing me to present today. So I'm going to start off just giving you a little bit of background about the Southwest Fair Housing Council. We serve the entire state of Arizona with fair housing services, and that includes fair housing enforcement. So basically, if somebody believes that they have experienced illegal housing discrimination, we can help them to exercise their fair housing rights. We do investigations based on the situation. We do testing, which is like mystery shopping. And then from there, we can file complaints with the Attorney General's office, with HUD, with the city of Phoenix, and sometimes we will file lawsuits, generally in federal court, to help people seek justice. We provide education and outreach throughout the state as well. We're active in every county in Arizona, and we provide our trainings free of charge for the most part. So if anybody is interested in a fair housing training for a group or for your workplace, we can generally accommodate that. And then the other thing that we do is discuss affirmatively furthering fair housing and access to opportunity, and that's what I am going to focus on today. So I'm going to give a real abbreviated presentation about housing segregation and access to opportunity. And where I'd like to start today is talking about the New Deal and white flight, and really how segregation came to be in large part in the 20th century, earlier as well, but particularly the 20th century in our country. So after World War II, well, you had the New Deal to deal with the Great Depression. You had a number of government agencies that came about, and that's when the federal government in particular really got involved in the mortgage market. And before the federal government got involved in the mortgage market, typically a mortgage was a 5-year term with a balloon payment at the end. So mortgages were not accessible for most folks in this country. Well, as the federal government gets involved, the mortgage market comes to be as it is today, basically where we have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage that has allowed, millions of Americans over the 20th century up through today to become homeowners and build equity in their homes. And the reason I called this particular segment of my presentation segregated housing not by choice is because housing segregation in this country is not a choice for folks. The federal government, local government, state government, the private market, real estate agents, associations of realtors all conspired and worked together to very intentionally create the segregated housing patterns that I will show you and that most of us know exist today. I also appreciate, I just wanted to say, I appreciate Mayor Romero's comments about nibbling around the edges, because I feel like housing segregation in particular is something that we have done very little about, and to even say that we've nibbled around the edges might be too generous. And I think it's important for us to talk about housing segregation, the history of it, as well as how it shows up today, because again, as Mayor Romero talked about, attacking the root causes is critical. And if we do not understand the history of housing segregation and how the legacy still impacts us today, we're really not dealing with the root causes of the housing issues that we have today. So as I was talking about the New Deal and what that entailed, so as the federal government gets involved in real estate and mortgages and housing, a number of these federal agencies that I discussed were really deeply entrenched. And one of those is the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And that's the agency that created redlining maps that have been gaining more people that have become aware of lately. So, those are basically maps that looked at different communities and rated neighborhoods by how they were able to receive mortgages or not, whether they were safe places to essentially grant mortgages. And so the areas that were considered the most dangerous for lending were often high minority areas with a high percentage of immigrants, and then those considered the safest to lend were white areas that were not only white, but were not even close to areas that had minority populations. So the very first time that the federal government gets involved in the mortgage market, it's a racialized system and a racist system. The Federal Housing Administration is another government entity that got involved in mortgages and in the housing market. And the FHA manual was also explicitly racist. It said that the government and agents and folks in real estate were to avoid, quote, mixing inharmonious racial or nationality groups, and, quote, the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended is not acceptable. And so basically the punchline of this story is that between 1934 and 1962, 98% of FHA loans went to whites. So essentially people of color, African Americans, Latinx, et cetera, were intentionally excluded from the mortgage market that the federal government created. The GI Bill, the Veterans Administration, lots of other government entities followed suit. So basically what you have is you have the New Deal creating white flight, new suburbs being built, infrastructure going out to those suburbs, new highways, et cetera. And essentially those suburbs were only available to white people. So I'm fast forwarding a bit now, but so I want to talk about the legacy of that today and how that affects people's access to opportunity. One of the things that we hear, at least in the housing world now, is that your zip code has a greater impact on your life outcomes than your genetic code. So this idea that where you live, the place that you grow up, has a bigger impact than even your genetics. And I think that we can definitely see that. So when we're talking about segregation and the importance, we're really talking about access to opportunity as well. So, based on the neighborhood you live in, what type of opportunity do you have access to? So I start talking about, well, what makes a high opportunity neighborhood? And I think it's one of those things that you know it when you see it, right? But as you can see from the slide, we're talking about, access to quality education, access to transit or other transportation to get you where you need to go, access to healthy food, access to safe and affordable housing, access to transportation, right? All of the things that we all kind of know are things that we need to thrive as humans in our community. So at the Southwest Fair Housing Council, we have done a project where we created maps that show access to opportunity and who has access to that opportunity based on race and ethnicity. And so again, this is just a real brief presentation. So the short story here is that we use census data. We looked at different pots of data. So we looked at housing data, economic data, transportation data, et cetera. And we threw all of it into a pot using GIS and created these maps. And the methodology that we used is from the Kirwan Institute out of Ohio State University. They came up with this great methodology and said, go forth and create maps in your own community. So they were very generous about sharing this data. But what this map shows is access to opportunity and where opportunity is in Tucson. And just to help kind of understand the map here, the darker the blue, the higher the access to opportunity. So the better access to jobs, better access to housing, education, all those things that I talked about. The yellows and oranges are areas of moderate to lower opportunity. And then the darkest red are the areas of lowest opportunity, again, using different types of census data. So as you can see in Tucson and the Tucson metro area, the areas of highest opportunity are the foothills, Oro Valley, Marana, and the suburbs again. And so again, think about what I discussed a little bit earlier with the federal government and the mortgage market and how that created white flight. So moving on, when we overlay race and ethnicity data on the areas of opportunity, so this map shows the bigger the circle, the higher percent Hispanic or Latinx, and the smaller the circle, the smaller the percent Hispanic population. And what you can see is in the areas of highest opportunity, according to the data that we used, the percent Hispanic population is generally very low. Obviously, there are some areas where there's some overlap. And then if you look just north of downtown and then in the corridor south of downtown, the areas of much lower opportunity have a much higher percent of Hispanic population. And then you flip that, and now we're looking at the percentage of white folks in Tucson and the surrounding areas. And obviously here you can see that in the higher opportunities, much higher percentage white. So another area where this shows up is in mortgage lending as well. And again, so, you know, thinking about the legacy that we have in this country and that shows up in Tucson and Arizona as well, you know, these laws and these mechanisms were, you know, put in place, you know, nearly 100 years ago and were active, you know, mostly up through the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. But I would argue that that is not really the history. That is actually what we see today, that the history and the segregation that was created in the 20th century has changed very little. And I think the maps I just showed demonstrate that. And then looking at mortgage lending, so I use this map of Phoenix. I know we're talking about Tucson, but I think the Phoenix map shows it in a little starker contrast. I'll show you the map in Tucson as well. And again, I'm not going to go into the methodology here, but we're looking at mortgage lending. So the bigger the circle, the more mortgages in that particular area. And this is 2012 through 2014. So it's a little dated, but studies have shown that this pattern continues. So what you're looking at here is the darker the red, the higher the Hispanic population in this map, 80 to 100% Hispanic. And you can see that in the areas of highest concentration of Latinx residents, there's essentially no mortgage lending going on. So again, kind of the idea of being shut out of the housing market and access to credit and capital is still a big problem. And this is the map of Tucson. Obviously, Tucson's a little bit smaller with less activity, but you can still see the same patterns here. Again, 2012 through 2014, you can clearly see where the mortgage lending activity is. It's in the areas of much higher much wider concentration. So again, that's a very brief presentation about housing segregation and access to opportunity in Tucson. But again, you know, I think the point that I really want to stress here is that, you know, we are living with the legacy of truly racist housing policy that, you know, when we're talking about equity and who has access to opportunity in this country and Tucson, people of color were intentionally excluded from housing, from living in particular areas, and from access to capital. So when we're talking about equity, you know, white folks, courtesy of the federal government and on down the line, were provided access to capital that was needed to buy homes. So when we're talking about equity, and you look at the home ownership rates and, you know, various other data, again, we have really just nibbled around the edges as a community, and as a country to remedy that situation. And if folks are more interested in this legacy and this history, there's an excellent book that came out, it's probably about 3 years ago now, called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which goes into much greater detail than I did here. But I will leave it at that. And again, thank you, and look forward to the conversation going forward.
Great. Thanks, Jay. Now Debi is going to give us a presentation on educational discrimination. Let me pull up your presentation.
Yeah, I think, Jay, your presentation was a really wonderful prologue to, or a preceding this presentation. And what this is really just a very short chronology of the history of segregation in education, and education being the #1 determinant of economic mobility and access to opportunity. And so what Jay described as truly racist housing policy also echoes itself in truly racist education policy in segregation. So I'm going to start with, and this just kind of lays the context for how we see placement and displacement of people of color, and access to housing, access to other opportunities. So in 1901, in the second slide, in 1901, we see that the Arizona legislature actually established that all children were to have equal access to educational opportunities, and written into the legislature was that there was no segregation in education. However, in 1909, they kind of reversed that law. And this was an amendment in the Civil Code in Arizona legislature that permitted that if more than 8 children were in a school district, that school district was to be segregated between blacks and whites. So from 1901 to 1909, we went from a fully segregated school system to a desegregated school system. Next slide, please. So in 1918, we have the establishment of the Dunbar School, which was the first formally segregated school in Tucson. And it was established by the Tucson Unified School District. It started actually in 1913 as the colored school on Cushing in downtown Tucson. And then TUSD moved it over to 325 West 2nd Street, where it still stands here in Tucson, Arizona. So here we see the first formally established Tucson Unified School District school, which was in the first African-American community in Tucson, which is the Dunbar Spring neighborhood. Next slide, please. So 3 years after the establishment of the Dunbar School, which ran from 1918 to 1951 as a segregated school, we see the desegregation of the Dunbar School. And this really wasn't done purely for altruistic reasons. It was actually part of the decision to desegregate Dunbar was that there was a growing population of African-American students in the school, and there was a need to establish another school. So in order to alleviate the cost of building that school, they decided to desegregate Dunbar, desegregate the schools in Tucson, and allow students to go to other schools. And this was 3 years before the Brown versus Board of Education. Next slide, please. So in 1973, we see that the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare reports that the Tucson Unified School District is racially imbalanced. It actually is racially imbalanced, and it isn't offering equal education opportunities to minority students. Next slide, please. So in 1974, the Office of Civil Rights tells the Tucson Unified School District that it has to eliminate minority identifiable schools, saying that no school should have more than 50% minority enrollment. At the same time, the TUSD governing board votes to oppose mandatory busing and reaffirms that equal opportunities are available to all students, although we are seeing in these schools that there is not equal resources in the schools. In the same year, Black plaintiffs and the NAACP file a lawsuit contending that the Tucson Unified School District isn't providing educational opportunities. And at the same time, 5 months later, Latinx plaintiffs file suit as well. And the two cases will be merged the following year. But what's important to know in this is that this is the establishment of what is the current desegregation order still happening in Tucson Unified School District. Next slide, please. In 1978, a US district judge issued orders that TUSD eliminate all vestiges of discrimination in schools. And the governing board of Tucson Unified School District closes 3 schools, including the Dunbar school. Next slide, please, yes. And then in 1983, we see that the legislature allows that school districts can raise property taxes, property tax levies above their statutory spending limits to comply with desegregation orders, because the desegregation order costs, because this lawsuit is quite expensive, and who is going to pay for the cost of this, of adjudicating the order. And that raises the ire of a lot of white parents, white individuals who have, whose children aren't necessarily part of the Tucson Unified School District, yet their property taxes are contributing to this. Next slide, please. And then in 2004, the governing board petitions to end the oversight of the desegregation order, saying it has complied with the settlement of the agreement, saying that they have taken steps to equalize the school districts. And then next slide, please. In 2007, TUSD institutes an open enrollment policy, saying that after the federal judge says that the racial imbalance mandate is unconstitutional. Next slide, please. In 2008, the US district judge lifts the desegregation order with one caveat, and it says that Tucson Unified School District has to produce a plan to show how it will work toward educational equity if it no longer faces court oversight. So if there's nobody overseeing equity issues in the no US district federal oversight, then how are they to know that desegregation orders are going to follow through? And so TUSD created a plan to address these shortcomings and created gifted and advanced placement classes, and tried to work towards racial equity in discipline policies and encourage racial mingling by allowing schools to create specialized niches that pull from students from all over the city. So next slide, please. In 2009, a US district judge does sign off on that plan and does lift the desegregation order. However, Latinx plaintiffs and the NAACP appeal, saying that the Tucson Unified School District hasn't addressed racial disparities for students at all. And so here we are now, 2010 to present, and that the desegregation order is under appeal, and that's where we are standing now. And again, I think if we overlay the housing policies with the overlay of desegregation policies and the migration of white flight and access to housing, access to opportunity, we can see a very clear correlation between housing policies, education policies, economic development, underfunding of in communities of color, under-resourcing in communities of color.
Thank you, Debbie. I think, yeah, it's obvious you start to look at the different layers of this and how they all sort of build on each other. and create this kind of this mountain that we have to find a way to
yeah,
get over.
it's this web of inequality that we feel that sometimes seems to be organic, but in fact is a calculated intent. Again, to echo Jay's words, a truly racist established a way of supporting communities or not supporting communities.
Right. Okay, and then Claudia, do you want to? You have a presentation on more focused on homelessness, I believe.
Let me share my screen here.
Yep. So.
You see that? Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. I am excited to be a part of this conversation, and to be able to have this conversation with also talking about housing, talking about education, helps so much, and to not be thinking about homelessness in a vacuum. That homelessness just happens, and it just happens to some people. That there are actual structures and policies that enable this to happen more often to some people than to others. So I'm going to share a little bit about some of the national racial and ethnic disparities. So a lot of you have seen this chart, some of you may not have, but when we look at this, it really goes to show us that when we're talking about disparities, and this comes up all the time when we're talking about police brutality, when we're talking about other things that impact some people at a rate that is not proportionate to the proportion of the population they make up in the United States. Sorry, my doorbell. So if we look at this chart, it shows us that African American people make up over 40% of the homeless population nationally, and while making up only about 13.5% of the general population. So when I say 40% of people who are experiencing homelessness are Black or African American, that probably raised some sort of a feeling for some of you. And so I want you to hold on to that feeling, because a lot of us make assumptions when we hear that. So what is it that is enabling more African American or African Americans to be making up 40% of our homeless population? And we'll come back to that. So we also, when we look at this chart, we also have this 2 or more races. And so when we have 2 or more races, it's confusing because we just end up eliminating this group of people because we don't know what they are. We don't know how they identify. We don't know what their experiences are. So one of the things that we have to do is to figure out how to dissect the mixed race or 2 or more races, because we don't have a good idea of who those people actually are. And then also disproportionate nationally are American Indians and Alaska Natives. And then we see, so when we look at the general population, we do see that white people are making up about the same amount of people experiencing homelessness as Black people, but making up so much more of the general population. And so nationally, we also see that people who identify as Latinx are overrepresented, slightly overrepresented in the homeless population. So this next slide is looking at the racial disparities in homelessness in Tucson and Pima County. And so if we look at the people in poverty, so, and just going back for a second, when we're sometimes people can draw some quick conclusions about, well, it makes sense that there's more people of color who are homeless because we know that people of color hold less wealth and less capital in our country. So that makes sense. But now we're looking at people who are living in poverty, and this is in our community. So there's 5% of people in poverty identify as African American or Black, but 12% experiencing homelessness and 8% experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So again, we know that this is a disproportionate number of people, of Black or African American people who are experiencing homelessness in our community. And that also includes families with children. Native American folks, if you were to look at this chart at first glance, you might make the assumption that, okay, well, Native American folks represent 7% of people who are living in poverty, and 7% of people who are experiencing homelessness, and 7% of people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. But what we also know is that when we are collecting data and doing these counts, we are not counting people who are living on tribal lands. So we're excluding a lot of people, and that's when we talk about some of the things that we can do. That partnership is one that we should form, so we'll have a better understanding of what Native American homelessness looks like in our community. And then finally, once again, we have 18% of people identifying as other, multiracial, mixed race, and that's the first group that we just exclude because we can't work to draw conclusions about those people who identify in that way. So the next slide is looking at ethnic disparities in our community. And so in poverty, we see that Latinx folks are overrepresented of people living in poverty. But then we look at homelessness, and the needle is shifted a little bit, that people who identify as Latinx are underrepresented in homelessness and in unsheltered homelessness. And there's some reasons that we know that might be the case, but we also know that some of our community members who are undocumented are less likely to participate in the data collection efforts in counting people who are experiencing homelessness. And then finally, we're back to noticing a disparity in that that Latinx families are overrepresented in experiencing homelessness. So the question is always, what can we do? And thinking about what are the major issues. And so there's a fantastic report that came out a few years ago and talking about, so it's a supporting partnership for anti-racist communities, SPARK report, talking about anti-racist homeless services, and launched a research effort across the country in 6 different communities. So this was done in Atlanta, Columbus, Ohio, Dallas, Texas, San Francisco, Syracuse, and Pierce County, Washington. And so the effort of the SPARK report is to look at all of the factors that impact homelessness in these communities. And some of the major issues identified were economic mobility, so a lack of economic capital within social networks, housing, the unavailability of safe and affordable housing options presents risks of homelessness and barriers to permanently exiting homelessness. Criminal justice, I think by now we all have heard of the inequities in our criminal justice system. So thinking about the ways that being incarcerated impacts homelessness. There's a report that states that a person who has been incarcerated is 10 times more likely to experience homelessness. And so when we know that that African Americans are incarcerated at alarming rates, it then increasing the likelihood that they will become homeless at some point. Behavioral health systems. People of color experience high rates of traumatic stress and mental health issues and in large part due to systemic racism and the impact of historical trauma and family stabilization. And I think that that really speaks back to what Jay mentioned earlier, and Debbie for that matter, in thinking about housing opportunities, education opportunities, and how that impacts family stabilization in a negative way. That in addition to community violence. So the SPARK report offers some recommendations, and none of these are a surprise to us. Organizational change, research, policy, and I think that this panel is a step in the right direction in thinking about that. But I would also like for you all to now go back. I said earlier that we were going to talk about, when I said 40% of people who are experiencing homelessness are African American.
Hey, Claudia, we can't see the presentation right now for some reason. Not sure
Can you
what's
see it
going on.
now?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, sorry. That 40% of people experiencing homelessness identify as Black or African American. Tom mentioned earlier that we have to stop thinking about homelessness as these individual things that a person did or didn't do. So if your first reaction when I mentioned that was thinking, even just a little bit, even just a piece of you thought, okay, well, yeah, but Black people are more likely to X or Y or Z, then that's where we need to take some individual action. And I'm not only speaking to folks who identify as white, I'm speaking to all of us, because believe it or not, all of us have grown in this same culture, and we've all been victims of that mentality. So it takes effort on all of our parts to shift the way we think about it, acknowledge the structural inequities, and stop thinking that it's a personal defect. So we can all begin to think about racial disparities in our communities. There's some great tools that already exist. They're not perfect, but they're a start, and they're tools that can help us to start the conversation. And so this example right here, this is not Tucson or Arizona. It comes out of a report from LA County. And, but this is an example of the kind of data that already exists that we can use to start thinking more deeply about the way our system impacts people. And so in this chart, we look at permanent supportive housing data and who's enrolling, who's exiting, and who's returning to homelessness. So, and in looking at that, we might draw some early conclusions that make us think, okay, well, you know, Black people are really entering permanent supportive housing at higher rates than Hispanic and Latinx folks or white folks, but having that return to homelessness rate be elevated. So what's happening? And I think that is a piece that we all really need to start to think about, is what's happening once folks are in our programs, and that knowing that treating everybody the same is maybe equality, but it's certainly not equity. So I think that's all. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Claudia. I do want to give Councilmember Santa Cruz a couple of minutes if there's anything she'd like to start off with today.
Well, thank you very much. I think just kind of hearing each panelist has really just made me think about the conversation that we've been having at the city level, at the Mayor and Council table, because I think I can understand a lot of what has been shared just from seeing like my family's personal experience. You know, I was born and raised here in Tucson. My parents lived in Section 8 housing for most of my life, till the county had a program that helped, you know, low-income families apply, you know, for mortgages, that then you paid, your monthly payment was based on your income, and that fluctuated. So that was the first time that my family, I was close to being 10, had the opportunity to purchase a home. But again, a lot of these, the housing, at least at that time that the county had, was outside of the city limits. So then you were like disconnected from like parks and community centers and transit, which, you know, we all very much depended on. So that was always a challenge. I think even, you know, them becoming an adult and becoming a parent myself, just trying to navigate the world of trying to like purchase a home or rent, and being frustrated that the areas of the city where I would want to raise my family or live are not accessible, are not like affordable for my income level. So those are just some of the, you know, experiences that I can relate to, and that people like in our generation are still struggling with a lot of the policies that were put into place, you know, 30 to 50 years ago. But so I did just want to highlight that we have, you know, for the past 2 years, I know that Mayor Romero has really been pushing us to think about the city implementing a housing first model, and what that would, what that can look like for us, and basically laying out the context of why this is needed here today. But I think that also pairs with the equity conversation that we just had last week at the Mayor and Council meeting, because a lot of what we're having to do is educate, you know, our colleagues and the public about why even having like an office of equity for the city, why that's needed, and not just like internally of how we do our work or the processes that we have in place, but also externally. Like, how do we measure where has the city been investing, you know, a lot of the propositions that have passed in recent years, what areas of the city, and if we can do kind of like a timeline of going back to like the 1960s, you know, to now, of where the city has been investing, because I personally feel like I can see it, you know. You drive around the city, you see the areas of town that, you know, there's sidewalks, or there's bus shelters, or there's, you know, trees lining, you know, the area, or there's nice parks. And you can see the parts of the city that don't have that kind of investment, and especially in older neighborhoods here in the city. So I think it's important that we have that information, and that we're like data driven, so that then as we move forward, we can make, you know, the investments and the policies that are going to rectify these like past grievances. I always say at the table, you know, as a way to like try to neutralize a lot of the defensiveness that comes when you're talking about race and you're talking about whiteness, and that these are really institutions, you know, that are in place. We're not talking about individual actors. We're talking about systems that have discriminated people and groups of people, but we didn't create them, but it is our responsibility to change that. Like that is all of our responsibilities. And I feel like that's our task. That's the work that we have to do. And then just the last piece, that we talk about opportunity a lot and having access, you know, to opportunities. And I think that when we're talking about equity, we're talking about better outcomes. And so if we're talking about what is that end goal, what are those outcomes that we want and that we need, and then we work backwards, you know, from that place. So I just wanted to share that, because sometimes the opportunity still puts it as like, oh, it's individual, you know, individual actors, you get bootstraps, you know, mentality, that we need to really look at the whole, you know, environment, and how are we going to get to those better outcomes. So thank you again to everybody, you know, for all the wisdom and context that was shared today.
Great. Yeah, thanks for your thoughts and comments, Swain. I think I think education is a huge part of this. I mean, just looking at some of the data that Jay was sharing and realizing that's only 5-6 years old, that those institutional patterns that were established, I think Jay, you were saying post-war, really part of the GI Bill, still exists today in terms of that's still our housing policy by this kind of legacy, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. And, you know, it's still shocking to me. Obviously, I'm a fair housing advocate and have been in the field for a while, but, you know, people still are very ignorant about the fact that, you know, our housing policy was created from all different levels of government and society. And that, what do you know, it wasn't actually a free market, and people didn't, not everybody had the right to choose where they wanted to live. So, you know, the education piece is huge. But, you know, I think also, you know, again, reflecting on Mayor Romero's comments about thinking outside the box, you know, I'll often get asked, well, what can we do about this situation? And I'm not a policy expert, and, you know, housing, how many trillions of dollars of, you know, wealth are wrapped up in housing. It's a, it's a heavy lift, but, you know, there was a strong political will to create the housing policies and the housing patterns that we have today. So yes, we need to think outside the box, but let's not pretend that we don't know that there are solutions out there, and that this was some sort of accident, and that we're, you know, it's not about political will, because at the end of the day, you know, I think there are plenty of ways to deal with these issues. It's just a matter of, you know, political will, and, you know, maybe education is a part of that for sure. So, you know, I think that's critical, and I appreciate the perspective of everybody about, you know, how this is really a layered thing: housing connecting to education, connecting to homelessness, connecting to, you know, the parks in your neighborhood. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And, Claudia, you know, we talked a lot about sort of the overall representation of persons of color experiencing homelessness, and so how do you see this kind of historical racial discrimination impacting the data that you're seeing in terms of how homelessness, how persons of color are represented in homelessness?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind, and I think that this is in all areas. So when I think about housing, it's systems that just absolutely do not seem accessible to people. So if your family has never owned a home and you've never seen anybody own a home, you absolutely don't believe that that is a system that's accessible to you. So I think I always feel like representation matters, and I think that we see that in our homeless service system as well, that representation of people who look like the people who are experiencing homelessness, providing the services, may impact the outcomes and success that people have within those services. And so I think representation matters across the board, be it in housing, in education, in homeless service programs, and that it's important that we not figure out how the people who we're serving can fit into the systems that we have, but how the systems we create can better suit the people who are accessing them.
So maybe this is for all the panels. So what are some things that are being done in the community that might sort of address either equitable housing or access to homeless services?
Well, I mean, I can talk just a little bit about what Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness is doing. And so there's been a recent committee formed to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in housing programs. And that committee is specifically looking at accessibility for all people who might be marginalized by housing programs or in housing programs. And that committee will use the data, some of the data that I shared, but other data points to take a deeper dive into looking at where people are successful, like at what points in housing, what areas are not having success, but also, so that's one thing that's happening is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee but then also doing widespread training for all of the housing providers and others in the community who want to receive this training. So the group that wrote the Spark report is doing a series of trainings for people in our community. So because it's all of the things listed. So it's not only individual action and people changing their individual perspectives, it's also changing agency culture, policies, and realizing that the people who work in agencies are real people too, with real perspectives. And so working to, so that all of the people who work in the agencies can be on the same page with regard to racial equity. And that particular initiative is not only about racial equity, but also looking at other marginalized folks, LGBTQ folks, and other people of color in general.
I have a question for my colleagues, particularly Tom, Jay. What are some of the ways in which we, folks that are working in community, can work more closely with your organizations and the work that you're doing to address and build stronger coalitions around this? Because I can say that you know, it's kind of a blind spot in terms of how we disseminate information, raise awareness, create opportunities for advocacy and transparency in our city governments, things like that. So do you have any ideas or thoughts of how even the four of us, you know, work more closely together?
Well, so it's a great question. I think one of the challenges that I've noticed over and I imagine the rest of you have also over my years in working now in nonprofit organizations, is that by nature the system is siloed. It's designed that way. Nonprofits are in competition with each other, and they're a business, and they operate like any other business, and grants come down in piecemeal. I can't remember who it was. There was an activist who talked about the United States has a programitis. Everything's a program, and you got a program for this and a program for that, and you got to write the grant a certain way, and if you write it this way, this is what they're funding this year, but maybe that's not what they fund next year. And so we all get tied up in this big knot versus having an agreement as a community on a community level mission, and to be able to say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. These are the metrics that we're going to use. And so for me, it comes to something not called a committee, because that scares, you know, that has been abused, I guess, so no one wants to hear the word committee. But somehow to have my push is to have some sort of a community-wide entity that has this and has the authority. So a lot of times we've had like middle management involved in this sort of thing versus having folks who have the authority to give assets and commit agencies and entities and government to come together and start that kind of process. There's lots of different ways I think that's been called in community, but it's really about that. And it has to come from, in my view, ultimately it has to come from government leadership. No matter how we slice it with all the nonprofits and all the efforts, the government entities have the funding that really moves the needle, as you may say. And so having that leadership involved, and I think we're at a perfect time with that in Tucson. When you look at the mayor's office, you look at the police department, you look at the county administrator, when it comes to housing, more and more of these pieces are coming into alignment. So I think ultimately that's what needs to be done if we really want to see an impact. It's a hard thing to sell sometimes because no one wants to go to another meeting. And so to try and make it in a way, and that's not my expertise really, to develop it in a way that it's meaningful and not just another meeting or another committee or another group. And I think that's where it's, you know, in our Housing First Forum roundtable that we've required, it almost seems snooty of us, but we've required that to participate in the leadership session, you need to be, you know, an executive director, a CEO, or a COO of an organization with the ability to commit the organization. Otherwise, there's no sense in an organization sending someone. So it's that requirement that we really have a group that can give resources and energy to this in a meaningful way. And to have community benchmarks, not just my benchmarks. You can go to all the nonprofit luncheons back when we had luncheons, and you would think that by Christmas, after going to all these luncheons, that we should have saved the world. But we don't really see markers moving because they're all silos. So anyways, I should let Jay or someone else jump in.
Well, I will just add, specifically with Southwest Fair Housing Council, there are a number of ways to engage. If you go to our website, swfhc.com, you can apply to be a tester. So we're always recruiting folks in the community to basically be mystery shoppers to recreate housing transactions and gather evidence in our investigations of illegal housing discrimination. And that's actually it's a volunteer position, but we do pay as well. So there's that. We also offer free education and outreach. Again, if folks are interested in learning more about, the basics of fair housing or more about what I presented today, there's that. But, I think, it's worth saying that, talking about access to housing and the role that Southwest Fair Housing Council plays, we're only an agency of 9 people, and we serve the entire state of Arizona, and we're the only fair housing agency in Arizona. So, we're day in and day out trying to make sure that people have access to housing, whether, it's folks with disabilities or people are, being denied because of race or ethnicity or, because they've got children. So, I think in this country, we need to start thinking about housing as a right. And Tom, I think you talk about that very eloquently. The number of people that are on Section 8 wait lists, for instance, I think the number is something like 1 in 5 people who income qualify actually get Section 8 housing. So there's a huge need there. We're facing an evictions crisis. We were before the pandemic, and now I just saw a presentation yesterday where a sociologist was talking about, doubling the number of homeless folks in Arizona just because of the pandemic, and that being such a conservative estimate that he was like, I don't even want to really, say that that's an estimate. So, we're looking at evictions. Again, all of these things, when we're talking about access to housing, to me, it's really about, what we as a community, what we as a state, what we as a nation believe housing is. Is it a right, or is it, something that only the market deals with or whatever? And, our current system, it just really leaves most of it to the market. So, when we're talking about how do we get access to housing, it's so under-resourced in so many different ways. I guess I'm of the mindset that really more government intervention is necessary because the government has pulled back from housing over the past 30 years in terms of giving more access. And we're at a place where clearly, the number of people that are in need of housing or have housing instability, the numbers are huge. So, clearly, again, I just think it goes back to political will and what we think housing is. Is it a right or is it not? And clearly, we don't think it's a right at this point.
I think that's kind of back to your point about even the FHA loans and the GI Bill. That scale of program that clearly benefited, the white population in mid-century through today. It would almost take a program of that scale to benefit people of color today.
Well, and I think it also goes to the point that, there was a period in this country where we were kind of more along the lines of thinking housing is a right, but that was a right for white people, and the access was given to white people. And once that access was given, clearly the ladder has been pulled up and said, oh, well, now, sorry, you're on your own if you didn't get in the game or your family didn't get in the game, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Good luck. So.
And I think this idea of a policy along that scale that you brought up, Michael, speaks to reparations. And what are we willing to do to reverse and advance the trajectory of advancement for people who have been systemically, left behind, way far behind the starting line. And so this conversation about reparations and housing policy, reparations and educational policy certainly needs to enter into the conversation about homelessness, as well as education and economic advancement. And it also brings to mind for me this idea that, Jay, you mentioned, let the market dictate the trend that we're moving towards, is the market dictating home ownership and development. And we're seeing the same thing in education and access to education, with the privatization and vouchers and the ability to make it so easily to underfund a community, to remove resources, to deconstruct a community instead of incentives to invest in it. And so all of these conversations, like you said, are so intricately woven together, but I think reparations needs to kind of start the parade of conversation.
Well, and Debbie, if I could just follow up, I mean, I think it's such an interesting conversation as well, because, if you just started to go down that road a little bit and really expanded access to housing, whether that's, through rentals or home ownership or whatever, if we did that as a society, the economy would boom. So, this idea of like, I know it ends up being kind of a tricky conversation about like, reparations, but I also just take a step back and say, we know that would be beneficial for the economy by and large. So if we know that we have this issue that we need to deal with, we know also that it would likely cause the economy to boom. Why are we not talking about that? And why are we not willing to do it? And to me, particularly, this has always kind of been my line of thinking, but this year in particular, I just go back to like, it's racism. I mean, that's the key piece that, we're still, as a society really not dealing with, though. Obviously this year, hopefully we're taking more strides, but, if you weigh all of these different elements, that's where I keep coming back to. We still have this racism that we need to address and get over in this country before we're able to do a lot of these things that we're talking about.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, could I say something? Just because we're talking about what can we do or what's being done, and I just kind of wanted to like let folks know, right, that we've been working on just rethinking what our housing commission, how it works and what it looks like. And so we just reestablished it as a commission on equitable housing, to deal with, especially in Ward 1, we're seeing the impacts of like gentrification and displacement, and it not feeling accessible, to folks, to families who've historically lived in those neighborhoods. And that I agree with what was said earlier about how this commission needs to like actually have like authority, or really get to like inform the policy and the investments, and what they need to look like. I think for a long time, a lot of the city's boards and commissions are kind of just like ceremonial, it's like you just have staff telling you what they're going to do, and people just kind of rubber stamp. And that we need to rethink that, like the folks on the ground, the folks who are living these experiences every day need to be the ones helping inform, form and guide us in what we need to do. The other thing I wanted to say is that we've been working on a vulnerability index and a poverty urban stress report, and that we're hoping to merge these two tools to function more like an equity atlas that cities like San Antonio have instituted, so you can see all the different layers in a way that it is informative, and that you're able to connect the dots of what's needed in those areas. So we're looking forward to continuing to push that. And then we also just have folks in the community. I want to give a little shout out to Sharia Jimenez, who's been working with the county and the city on having like bringing in trainings like the Incremental Development Alliance. They're based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, but they're helping train small developers and helping like our local folks strengthen their own neighborhoods by being the champions and get the kind of development that their community needs and wants. And so I think that's really exciting when, you know, just like folks from the community here are thinking creatively of ways that we can address some of these issues. So I just wanted to share that with folks.
Yeah, well, that's great. I know you and the mayor both have been really leading a lot of efforts to help the more vulnerable populations in our city. So just really appreciate everything that you're doing. We've got to
add one quick thing.
Yeah.
As a community-based researcher, you bring up such a good point about talking to people and really having the community be involved in decisions that are being made. It's not enough. So I talked about the committee and that we'll use data to help inform our decisions, but we can't keep trying to provide things and resources and programs to people without having a true understanding of what people want and what people need. And I think even though some of us may represent some of those communities, those of us who have secure housing can't be making all of the decisions for people who are having housing insecurities.
You bring up a great point, Claudia. I think it's like baked into, well, it's baked into racist systems, but it's also kind of baked into the nonprofit system, this sort of paternalism that somehow I've come here, I'm going to put on my cape, I know better, and I'm going to develop something. And it is a lot of research on like, how can I convince people to do what I want them to do? And this assumption that they don't know the right thing to do. And this is, you know, really baked into the system. And once, I know for me, once I became more aware of that, oh, you just see it everywhere in my own organization, outside organizations, to where I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not being a entity for the community to use. I'm under some assumption that somehow I'm some sharp fellow who knows better, and I'm gonna show up one day with this program and plop it here, and woo, that's gonna solve it, you know? And it's really baked into the system, and to get rid of that, I think is, or to try and reduce that is important. That's a real critical concern, I think.
Hey,
Thanks, Tom.
Michael, I know we're running low on time, but I was just looking at the Q&A, and somebody, I just wanted to address real quickly, somebody mentioned criminal backgrounds as being a potential area for housing discrimination, and it definitely is. We've definitely seen at Southwest Fair Housing Council that, again, folks that are similarly positioned, say African American and a white person, both with criminal backgrounds that are similar, we definitely see white folks being favored more, given more help to get into housing. So if anybody is listening and is on the webinar who has any specific instances where that has happened or they've experienced that, that is something that we at Southwest Fair Housing Council can potentially help with. So I would again encourage you to reach out to me directly or through our website. But anyway, I just wanted to flag that because I saw the Q&A. So
Thanks. I also want to mention our next Housing First Forum event in October. We're going to be focusing on criminal justice and homelessness. So keep your eyes out for that. So we could just a couple minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any parting comments before we wrap it up.
I definitely want to thank the panel. I really appreciate your time. Time's an important currency, and I appreciate you sharing your time with the community.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I think this is a really important conversation. Thank you for the opportunity to kind of weave these things together in ways that don't often happen. And so thank you to your organization for providing a platform for that to happen.
Absolutely.
I echo those sentiments. I'm happy to have be able to participate, and I also want to thank everybody who participated as an attendee today. I think some of these conversations can be difficult, and people are in varying spaces with regard to thinking about racial equity. So I appreciate everyone who's willing to engage in the conversation and in thinking about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm really honored to have been a part of this group. And, you know, clearly we're at a time where these issues are bubbling up in a way, at least that I don't think that I've seen it in my lifetime. And, you know, I'm hopeful that we can take this opportunity to move the ball forward, because we definitely have more work to do. And I also just want to applaud Old Pueblo for the work that you guys are doing and your approach. And I also want to applaud Lane and Regina about the work that you guys are doing and the way that you are attempting to look at this through a different lens, because I feel like that's just a critical step. So again, thanks to the group and thanks for the work that everybody on this panel is doing.
Yeah, thanks again to everyone. You know, just for me, is like my closing is what we're really seeing, or what we're trying to continue to generate, is like a value shift. Like Jay, you were talking about, like, do we see housing as a right, you know, or for who is it a right or who is it not? That we really center that value, and then that we follow it up with policies and investments, you know, that address it. So again, thank you all for the work that you're doing. I see my role. I'm like, if y'all want to reach out, you know, as a policymaker, you know, for the city here, I see my role is like elevating, you know, these conversations or the ideas and the policies that y'all want to see happen, to push those through. So please see me as a resource for bringing this to the mayor and council.
And I'd say the same thing to you, Lane. You know, you should see us as a resource for the things you're working on. If you need information or assistance, or, you know, whatever you need, we're happy to help in any way we can.
And you know what, Michael, this will, I'm sure, take us over, but I'm guilty of that usually. Something that came to my mind just now, I was talking with SAMHSA, a government entity with addictions and mental health in DC, and they mentioned that in DC now they have the right to shelter. And if it may be a stepping stone for us around the right to housing, is to say that if an entity has shelter beds, unless they can demonstrate that it's a danger to themselves or others, that they can't turn people away if they have space. Because today in Tucson, you could say, you know what, I run a shelter, I take government money, but this person maybe doesn't take a breathalyzer, or this person has, their mental health is off the charts, or they don't have an ID, I don't really know who they are. To be able to say no, in Pima County or in the city of Tucson, if you come for shelter and there's a shelter bed, you have a right to shelter. Just a thought.
No, that's a great point. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And yeah, watch out for our next event. And certainly, I know we'll all be continuing these conversations. So thanks again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.